Vacancy Legal Recruitment, a refreshingly unique and personal talent agency developed specifically for legal. Dedicated to the sector and with extensive experience working across legal services and legal technology, we bridge the gap between your requirements and top-tier legal talent. Get in touch today and say hello at vacancy.co.uk.
You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Conveyancer podcast. Today we are talking a little bit about climate change. Very specifically, we're talking about an event in London in 2022. In fact, we're chatting around about the 3-year anniversary of this event. It happened on the 19th of July 2022. It's called the Wennington Wildfire, but wild in the sense that it was actually relatively central in London rather than on any particular grassland or anything like that. And it has implications very specifically for the property sector and of course for conveyancing. With me today I have Richard Flemmings, CEO and founder of Map Impact, and Oliver Baldock, Director of Ashfield Solutions, to tell us about this case and what it means. In the first instance, chaps, I wonder if you might give us a bit of background. Ollie, tell us about yourself and what you do.
Hi, thanks for having me on. Ollie Baldock. I'm a chartered geologist, director at Ashfield. Ashfield is an environmental risk consultancy, so we deal with flood risk and climate change, sustainability and contaminated land. A lot of my background's in contaminated land, and then around 5 or 6 years ago, I started shifting more towards sustainability and climate change work. And that was really triggered by the Bank of England's new supervisory statement, SS319, and we got involved I was part of the consortium that led the first climate data pilot with NatWest Bank. So the banks were starting to take climate change seriously at this point because the PRA had started regulating them, and we did a demo of how you could look at a mortgage portfolio and assess the risk. And since that time, I've been involved with a mid-tier lender and real estate investment trust, looking at how they onboard climate risk data, how they look at their portfolios, and also then once you've looked at risk across a portfolio and the different climate perils that you have to deal with, how do you triage that risk and get it down to more practical mitigation measures? So there's sort of a blend in my background of climate risk, climate data at sort of large scale, portfolio scale, right through down to the consultancy level, where actually, you've triaged the risk down to a single property or a handful of properties, be they commercial properties or residential, and then looking at what can you do about that to manage that risk, whether that's as a lender or, we do a lot of work with the conveyancing sector as well. So in terms of flood risk, we've identified a potential hazard. What is it we can do about it? How real is it? What are the practical steps that a home buyer might be able to take? So that's my general background.
And Richard, please.
Yeah, hi David. Thanks for having me on the podcast. So yeah, my background is primarily in the geospatial sector, so geospatial data industry. I'm a chartered geographer. I have a degree in cartography, and I've been focused on taking satellite Earth observation data and doing interesting things with that for the last sort of 12, 15 years of my career. And that led to the foundation of Map Impact. And the focus of Map Impact is to provide understanding of climate risk at very large scales. So what I mean by that is we produce national level data layers that provide understanding of susceptibility to specific climate hazards, and that's all property specific. So what we found is that there's a huge volume of data and really interesting information out there and available. And what we're doing is in taking that, harnessing it, interpreting it into something that's easy to use and meaningful. So we're working with, for example, housing associations, local authorities, insurers, financial services groups, as well as conveyancers, to help them understand what the risks are of all of their assets to climate change, as climate change becomes more and more of a growing risk as we go into the future.
Really helpful introductions, thank you. And I will at some point during the podcast pick your brains on what the future looks like and some of the drivers behind this agenda. But very specifically today, we're talking about this event that happened, as I say, 3 years ago in Wennington in London. It's called the Wennington Wildfire, but as I say, not a particularly accurate moniker. Richard, give us the story, give us the scenario here and what happened.
So if we remember back to July 2022, that's when the hottest temperature ever recorded occurred in England, where we tipped over 40 degrees. And that was part of a spell of drought, high temperatures that were prolonged. And what that led to was very dry vegetation across the country, and particularly in the southeast. And when you have dry vegetation, that means fuel for wildfires. So around this time, in July 2022, the London Fire Brigade had their busiest days since World War II. So there were a number of wildfires that occurred, Wennington being the most famous one of those, but there were several occurring on the same day. So what we saw was the fire brigades stretched to the absolute limit here. And this was something that came sooner than was forecast. So what I mean by that is that we've been forecasting increasing temperatures, we've been forecasting these extreme events, but this caught everyone a little bit by surprise because this kind of thing wasn't expected for another 3 to 5 years into the future. So with Wennington specifically, what happened, or the conditions for Wennington, were that this is on the wildland sort of urban interface. So it's still within the M25 boundary. As you said at the beginning there, David, it's very close to London, but it's in this suburban area where you're on the edges of wildland urban interface. And that's not an unusual situation that Wennington found itself in, really. There's a lot of this type of land around London. So we saw this kind of spread of wildfire because of the landscape around these properties, because of the fuel that existed, because of drought, because of the vegetation was all dry. And then once a fire started, it becomes very, very difficult to control because it spreads very quickly in those conditions. And that's what we saw. We saw 17 properties burnt down. And then that's where it's probably good at this point to hand over to Ollie, because this is where Ashfield began to get involved once that fire had actually taken place.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Yeah, so, I mean, as you pointed out, Rich, there were other fires at the same time, and they didn't get the same media coverage, but actually in the same borough in Dagenham, there were, I think, 10 other properties destroyed through a separate fire in the Rookery Farm estate. So, Wennington was the one that kind of got the headlines. But I guess, yeah, our experience in Ashfield, we've sort of seen the after effect of this. So it's the bit when the cameras have sort of disappeared, and it's no longer in the news. And we've been involved in going out to those sites and looking at the environmental condition of the land. So, when you have a big fire like this, you have all the ash and the debris that's gone to the ground, and that can contain things like asbestos and various other potential contaminants. And so we've been involved since 2023 in virtually all of the houses in Wennington as part of the rebuild programme. So we've been employed by loss adjusters, building surveyors, planners, architects, looking at how they get these properties back through the planning process and back up and built again. And it was quite striking to us, I think, in being involved in that, realising that sort of that impact and the devastation that actually has on people and how long that lasts after the actual event.
The actual cause of the fire is a spontaneous combustion of a compost heap, isn't it? I mean, that is utterly bizarre.
Suspected cause. Yeah. Sorry, go on, Rich.
I was just going to say that there were a number of points in the landscape. So yes, I think there's one of the suspected causes was this compost heap. but there were a number of sort of locations in the landscape surrounding these houses that could have also been the cause of this. And really, the point here is that the landscape around where these houses are was almost primed for this sort of thing to happen. So there was very susceptible to a wildfire starting. So having some awareness of this nearby risk goes some way to allow property owners to take preparatory steps and think in different ways. And I think the thing that's interesting for me in this country, when we see wildfires in somewhere like LA, which has had really devastating wildfires, and Western USA, Canada, and so on, you're not too surprised. When you see them in Southern Europe, you're not too surprised. But I think it is quite a surprising thing to think this has happened within the M25 boundary and in London. And everything's pointing towards this becoming more frequent. So we're 3 years on from this happening. This particular year that we're in now, 2025, we've had a prolific wildfire year in the UK, where we've had more wildfires by the middle of April this year than we had in all of last year. We've got a huge part of the country in drought conditions at the moment. We saw Cumbria in a drought in May, which is unheard of. And we're recording this in early July. We've just had our second heat wave in England. That's very unprecedented as well. So we're in another unprecedented year of dry and hot events this year. And the trend is for this just to become more and more frequent going forward.
I think that wildfire perception issue is interesting, isn't it? That we see these things on telly in, like you say, in California, and we think of forests burning in effect. Whereas it's not quite the same here. And what Richard's talking about there, that sort of urban-rural interface, probably what we're most likely seeing more of is grass and arable land fires, which are at that interface, rather than these kind of big forest fires that we might see in California. So I think there's perhaps a little bit of reframing in terms of how we look at it in this country.
Is there a reframing in how we as a profession should be looking at this as well? Because I don't think what we're saying here is that the lawyer is expected to mitigate the risk of a suspected spontaneous combustion of a compost heap. Rather, and to your point about the long tail, we need to be looking at this from the point of view of the aftermath of the impact of this, rather than the preventative stuff, or do we need a bit of both?
I would suggest there's room for both here. Now, I don't think this is the conveyancer's responsibility ultimately. I think a lot of this is actually outside the control of the homeowner as well. So if we think as a flood, as a climate risk, which whenever you think of climate change in this country, or there's an article about climate change, there's a photograph of somewhere being flooded. And we're getting used to that now. We're getting used to that as a thing that people need to think about. There's only so much a homeowner can do because they have responsibility for the bit of land that they're on. And actually what needs to happen here is, in my view, there needs to be a holistic view of how the landscape is treated and adapted. So in the case of Wennington, we've seen 17 dwellings burnt down that all sit in their own red line boundary, their own pieces of land. But actually it's the arable land and some of the other land around the edges that have been contributed to the cause of this, which is obviously outside the control of the conveyancer and the property owner. The point here, I think, from when we come on to talk about the Law Society Practice Note, which I know we will come on to talk about, is that the solicitor can inform the homeowner that this could be a risk for them, which means that they can then have the knowledge of this. And there are some activities that people can do to help prevent this, or to keep this susceptibility, sort of understand this susceptibility and act accordingly.
To take that point then, Ollie, what is that long tail? What is the impact? I mean, you talked about, for example, contaminants in the land, and you're still involved in Wennington, or you were involved there for a period of time after the actual event. What is the risk to the homeowner after the wildfire?
So when we talk about long tail, it kind of has two meanings here. The way I think about it is a wildfire in itself is a long tail event. If we look at a probability distribution, it sits at the tail. It's a very low likelihood, but very high consequence event. So, in the middle of that probability distribution, we might have, typical autumn rainfall, which might flood some streets and cause a nuisance and impact on traffic, but is resolved relatively quickly and people can recover quite rapidly from that. At the tail end of this curve, we have these more extreme events, which don't happen that often, but when they do, they have huge consequences. So there's a sort of a technical element to what we think about in terms of tail risk. These are tail risk events from a probability point of view. But the way Rich and I have talked about this is actually there's a practical tail risk as well, which is that there is a long tail to the consequence of the event. So when something like this happens, as I said before, the TV cameras are all there on the day of the event. There's flames licking around people's windows and people are running out with their belongings. And then when the cameras disappear, we don't really hear much about it. And, our experience in Ashfield of sort of seeing that is one of, I guess, this process of attrition that people have to go through, not only having the psychological disruption of having their home destroyed and their personal belongings destroyed and having to find alternative accommodation, but it's that longer term impact then of resettling your life, the impact on that property landscape itself, the process you need to go through to get those things rebuilt. And from Ashfield's point of view, a small part really in looking at the environmental condition of the site, but effectively going through all of those processes that you need to go through to get those properties rebuilt again. And that in itself has a sort of consequential impact because there's a lot of money involved in trying to do all those things, all of those surveys that are required, all of the planning process to get those properties back up again, the demolition works that are needed to get things safe, to create a footprint to rebuild those properties. And then it's not just the homeowners, it's the other stakeholders that are involved. So a number of the properties at Wennington were either uninsured or underinsured. So we have this wider impact where actually people can't necessarily claim on their insurance for these works. Or perhaps, property next door was the one that this fire spread from and they weren't insured, but you were insured, and who pays out? So you have all these sort of complicating factors involved following what is a relatively rapid destructive event. So I think that the tail risk is this sort of technical element and this kind of wider long-term psychological and personal and property impact.
And I think one of the things that's come out of the climate change discussion, and one of the things that conveyancers have really railed against, is that this responsibility has obviously landed on their desk. But the driver here is the lenders, the insurers, because they're looking at their housing stock and saying, well, how robust is it? And then, there's a huge amount of criticism of new build properties, for example. How robust, if it's not too difficult a question to answer, is the UK housing stock to these seismic events?
I think when we think about the housing stock here in the UK and how it's positioned to be adapted to these kind of what we might call new climate perils, such as wildfire, the way that we look at this in Map Impact is that we're looking at the whole landscape. So we're looking at the property in the context of its surrounding landscape. And that's really important because it's what you see is that, as I've talked about before, is that you've got the fuel for wildfire is within the landscape. And it's to do with how dry the landscape is. It's to do with how much vegetation there is. And so what may need to happen in the future is that we look at not just the houses themselves here, but we look at how the landscape is designed around them. So, for example, we've worked with a very large housing association over the last year, and the reason they're interested in understanding wildfire is they have a lot of land that they're responsible for, and they're beginning to think, well, could we design that land in such a way that we put in fire breaks? So if the worst case, there is a wildfire that's happened and it's spreading, can we adapt that land to put fire breaks in place? So that's one small example. And when it comes to insurance and financiers, yes, that's exactly what we're experiencing at the moment. So we're seeing our data, which gives this property specific susceptibility score for every property in the UK. We're seeing insurers and lenders coming to us and saying, can we take your whole data set to look at the risk across our entire portfolio, so they can then begin to think about how they build this in, mitigate this, and organize this in their business going forward. So the conveyancing transaction is just really one part of the property life cycle, but what we're seeing is that every part of the property life cycle is paying a lot of attention to this at the moment.
I would only really add that I think in terms of the resilience of our housing stock, I don't think we're improving anything. And potentially from the point of view of a wildfire, we could be making things worse. I read an article recently about, the government's housing targets and how we get there and how we do that at speed. And one of the ways we can do that is to build more timber framed homes, because they can be manufactured quite rapidly. They can be built in factories off-site, put up quite quickly, and that's great. And it ticks a number of other sustainability goals. It locks up a lot of carbon in the timber, which is all great. But of course, if you're doing that from the point of view of a wildfire hazard, it's not the most resilient form of construction. And so there are always, I think, kind of trade-offs in this, and it's very difficult to do one thing without compromising on something else. And I don't think there's just a single magic wand on what we do for wildfire and how you can suddenly mitigate against that risk. I think, like Richard's saying, a lot of this, there are practical steps that homeowners can take just to be sensible about what they do, and making sure that effectively they've not surrounded themselves with fuel for a wildfire to catch and spread onto their property. I think if you were you're buying a new home and that's the point at which you might be undertaking some renovation works, you could, from a practical point of view, say, well, actually, if I know that I'm backing onto some grassland where there is a wildfire risk, I might try and find out who the owner of that land is and, see if we can get some kind of fire break put in. But actually, if I'm replacing my fence, maybe I won't put a timber fence up. Maybe I'll put some fire resistant material on that fence. So there are some practical steps that you could take for your own home, but a lot of this is much more holistic, as Richard said.
So if we come on to the practice note, as you've suggested that we probably would do in the course of the conversation, Richard, what does it say about climate events and the expectations on firms, and does it really go into detail around sort of mitigation that homeowners themselves can take, or is it really just focused on this is what the role of the conveyancer is when it comes to their advice on climate change?
I see it as this is the second part of that. This is their role when it comes to climate change. So the way that I see this is that, many conveyancing reports have incorporated flood risk for a long time and an understanding of susceptibility during a flood event of a property. And this really is no different to that. It's almost giving a warning. So it's kind of suggesting during that conveyancing process, there may be an issue here. You may be susceptible to these new climate risks. But even by saying that, the conveyancing is somewhat discharging their responsibility. They're becoming compliant with what's in the Law Society Practice Note by just saying, this is some information we have, and we understand the susceptibility of this property to be this. That then makes the conveyancer compliant. And the way that we've positioned our data within this is to allow for that to happen. And there are some report providers that are using our data already. We would encourage conveyancers to go and ask their report providers if they're including all of these climate risks. And if not, then request them, because that removes an element of liability on the conveyance, and it means that they then become compliant with what's in the Law Society Practice Note.
My understanding is very much that there's an expectation on solicitors to inform, and I think you can't do that unless you have that data initially, that information in the search report. I don't think there's anyone saying that that solicitors should be able to remove or mitigate that risk. But I think from the point of view of a home buyer, which ultimately we all are at some point, or most of us, it's placing them in an informed position. I don't think we should be shielding people from information which ultimately insurers have access to, lenders either already have access to or very soon will have access to. And lenders are there's a consultation out now on the supervisory statement for climate change, which looks likely to be a lot more prescriptive and slightly firmer on the banks. And so really what conveyancers are doing is effectively passing and giving access to home buyers information that these other organisations already have, and I don't think we should shield them from that. I think we should inform them and let them make a choice. And sometimes that may be deciding to go ahead in full knowledge that there is a potential hazard and accepting that, or saying I'm going to find out who owns the land next door, or I'm going to speak to my local councillor and just find out if there's something I can do about that. But I'm still going to buy the home because I've lived in this village for 30 years and I found the perfect home, but at least I'm informed, I'm aware. So for me, it is about informing and not being shy to present this information to the home buyer.
So on a really practical level, the conveyancer can discharge their responsibility or liability over to you. Do you as organisations then deal directly with a potential home mover if they've got particular queries about the property?
So where we're positioned in this, David, is we have used a series of data sets that are available, brought those together to give this idea of a susceptibility for every location, so property specific susceptibility score. Alongside that, we provide a series of guidance notes around what those scores actually mean. So what does it mean when you're in a high area versus a low area? And the way we split that is to say, this is the guidance for the structure in the building, and this is the guidance for you from the point of view of health and individuals. And what we're seeing is that we provide that alongside our data, and what we're seeing is that the conveyancing report providers who are using our data so far, and we're expecting others to start using it soon, is that they're incorporating some of that information alongside the score. So not only do you receive a risk score of low, medium, high, for example, you also receive some information around that to say, what does that actually mean? When it comes to then property specific information, there are people who are adding that value on top of what we're doing. So some of the conveyancing report providers, for example, are adding some of that on top of what we're doing. And again, that's where we see a collaboration with Ashfield, because that's what they're doing with flood data, for example.
It is certainly fair to say that we're going to see a lot more written around climate change. We're certainly going to hear an awful lot more about it through forums like the Today's Conveyancer podcast, no doubt about it. And there's a lot of empathy, and I think we were talking at a recent conference, you guys have a lot of empathy for conveyancers as well in this scenario, but the guidance, as you understand it, and as the Law Society have also said, is pretty clear. It's to inform, as you say, Ollie, advise of the potential risks, not necessarily to put people off, because people have got different risk thresholds in their own lives, and point them in the direction of where they can get more information. I guess as a kind of roundup and a final thought, really, to end the podcast, I wonder if you guys might share your own thoughts and predictions for the next sort of 5-10 years around this whole debate on climate change and how important it's going to be in the home moving process. I suspect I'm asking turkeys to vote for Christmas, but I'm interested in kind of your thoughts as to the direction of travel here.
Thanks, David. I can take that one first. I think for me, this is only going in one direction. So all the evidence in the UK is for more and more extreme weather events. And what I mean by that is I've talked about 2025 being a very hot and dry year. We've had, several months with very little rainfall. But very recently, we've also had a huge amount of rainfall late last year and floods that came with that. And that's the trend, is these peaks in events. And what that means for something like wildfire is if you have a lot of flood and a lot of water, that grows vegetation quickly, which then dries out and becomes fuel for wildfire. So we're only going to see this increasing over time, is my view. That's everything's pointing in one direction. And so there is a holistic picture here. There is something about considering the whole landscape and understanding how we can adapt to these changing climate risks in the UK. But for the property sector, I think it's about beginning to think about that adaptation, beginning to think about locations that are more susceptible to these new climate risks, and really thinking about how we can be adapting what we do. Can we be using new building materials, as Ollie said? Can we be thinking about the land around our homes and properties more, and how we can make that more future proof as these events happen more and more in the future? Personally, I'm very, very interested in that landscape scale mitigation and working with organisations on that. And that's where I'm pushing as I go into the next 5 to 10 years, is thinking about this in a really holistic manner.
And Ollie, you only need to look at the density of housing on new build plots as a great example of what you were talking about earlier around some of that risk mitigation. That's almost a very straightforward way that we can start to tackle this, isn't it? But there'll be other things that we can do as well.
Yeah, I mean, through the planning process could enable us to do more, I think, but in a number of climate risks, flood risk as well. I mean, that is managed through the planning process, but there are gaps in how that's closed out. And I don't think wildfire, for example, is something that's really addressed at all, but it really ought to be, because there are probably some very simple measures that could be put in place as part of new schemes to mitigate and manage that risk. I mean, for me, the direction of travel, as Rich says, the science is pretty clear in terms of what we can reasonably expect in terms of the sort of increased number of climate-related disruptive events, if you want to call it that. Wildfire being one of them, extreme heat, drought, flood, they're all there. We know those are the trends are heading in one direction. I think for me, what will be interesting to see is how we shift now, and they're starting to see a shift from a focus on sort of carbon reduction. So it's very much been, if we think about retrofit, for example, in properties, all of the emphasis has been around EPC, energy efficiency, and very much the conversations that I've had with lenders over the past 5 or 6 years, the priority has been EPC, because there are minimum energy efficiency standards and there are tangibles to work towards, and it helps them shift in this sort of transition risk, helps them meet certain targets, etc. We are now starting to see, and just last month there was a report published by the Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Leadership, where they start talking about a reframing of retrofit. So actually starting to recognise that retrofit isn't just about what we do to reduce the emissions from our building stock and about improving energy efficiency. It's about improving resilience and adapting. And that means things like, wildfire resilience. It means things like flood resilience. And so for me, what will be interesting to see, and I think we probably will get there, but it's a question how long it takes, is where we start to see things like perhaps, mortgage lending starting to factor in resilience as part of loans. Do we get to a point where, a lender says, yeah, there is a risk here, but if you do these things, we can reduce that risk, and we can incorporate that into the lending profile for this property. So I think we know what the trends are in terms of the science, in terms of the climate events we're likely to see. It's the question of how we now respond to it and react to it. And I think resilience has to be a key part of that.
Ollie, you've raised some really great points there about retrofit, and We're doing a lot of work with housing associations at the moment who have property portfolios that are sort of 10, 15,000 properties. And they're beginning to look beyond the home, I would say. So typically retrofit has looked at the materials within the home, the building itself. What we're seeing is them begin to think about the neighbourhood and the surroundings of that home. And that's where I see a lot of activity happening in terms of mitigation and change. You know, you mentioned, David, how dense some new build estates are. And it's just thinking about some of these climate risks as you're designing those new estates, but then thinking about activities that you can do around properties and in neighbourhoods to help mitigate some of these risks that don't even require those interventions necessarily within the home. So that's where we're seeing a lot of work happening at the moment.
A topic we could probably discuss for the rest of the day, but we have run out of time. It's been great to have you both on the podcast, sharing some insight into particular issues that affected Wennington a few years ago, and also the kind of wider picture as well, and thoughts about that impact on the homeowner. Thank you both for joining the Today's Conveyancer podcast. Thank you, Ollie.
Thank you very much for having me.
And Richard.
Thanks for having me, David.
The Today's Conveyancer podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todaysconveyancer.co.uk. My thanks to Richard and to Ollie. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.